Hi, I'm Micah Halpern. Thank you for joining me today as I do some thinking out loud. Our first segment is called Background Briefing. The first thing I've been thinking about is Jerusalem and the Jewish calendar. The Jewish calendar has its own metabolism, and Jerusalem is at its epicenter. That incredulous fact is brought to our attention most specifically during the period known as the 3 weeks. The 3 weeks of summer we are now living through. The 3 weeks that begin with the 17th of the Jewish month of Tammuz and culminate on the 9th day of the Jewish month of Av. 3 weeks that are bookended by days on which we fast. And why do we fast? We fast as a way of remembering and mourning. Remembering the temples of Jerusalem, the mourning destruction. The 17th of Tammuz commemorates the date on which the walls of the city of Jerusalem were breached during the Second Temple period. The Second Temple period. The 9th day of Av memorializes the destruction of both temples, the first and the second temples. Jewish tradition, using the Jewish calendar as its vehicle, has created a yearly mourning period for Jerusalem, symbolized most strongly, most devoutly, most obviously by the temples. The place where Jews came to deliver their long ago sacrifices in the service of God. Jewish traditions are established to dictate behaviors that force Jews to not only remember, but to feel the destruction of Jerusalem through the Jewish calendar. Traditions in place today so that our collective memory never forgets what happened, what befell the Jewish people those so many years ago. And not merely during these 3 summertime weeks. The Jewish month of Tevet falls during wintertime. And on the 10th day of Tevet, Asara B'Tevet, as it's called, Jews once again fast. It's on that day in history that the Babylonians besieged the city of Jerusalem. The Jewish month of Tishrei heralds the fall season and the New Year. The 3rd day of Tishrei, the day after Rosh Hashanah, the New Year, we fast yet again, all connected to Jerusalem. The 3rd day of Tishrei is Tzom Gedaliah, the fast of Gedaliah. It is the day when Gedaliah, the Babylonian appointed king of Jerusalem, was assassinated. And Jews fast because Gedaliah, king of Jerusalem, was good to the Jews. His assassination was a loss to the Jews of Jerusalem, to their community, and to their communal safety. His assassination marks the end of Jewish life in Jerusalem. Jews fast to remember the loss of King Gedaliah of Jerusalem. So good was he to the Jews that we even proudly name our children after him, a non-Jewish king. While the Jewish calendar dictates that we mourn Jerusalem, it also dictates that we celebrate Jerusalem. 3 times a year, the Shalosh Regalim, the 3 pilgrimage holidays. Jews from all over Israel, all over the world for that matter, traveled to Israel, to Jerusalem, to deliver their sacrifices at the temple. And those are the 3 holidays of Sukkot in the fall, Pesach in the early spring, and Shavuot in the closing of the spring and the beginning of the summer. They are the 3 pilgrimage holidays, holidays during which Jews ascended and pilgrimaged to Jerusalem. Almost every Jewish holiday is Jerusalem-based. The only exception, a glaring exception at that, is the holiday of Purim. Hanukkah, let's say for instance, the Festival of Lights, commemorates the rededication of the temple in Jerusalem. The Jewish New Year, Rosh Hashanah, and Yom Kippur, the fast of Yom Kippur, the holiest day of the entire Jewish calendar, are certainly Jerusalem-centric. The liturgy speaks of the temple and Jerusalem. Jerusalem is at the very soul of Judaism. Removing Jerusalem from Judaism would be a serious mistake. It is a lesson, by the way, that the Reform movement learned only too well. In 1885, the Reform movement attempted to deracinate, that is, to rip out from the roots, Jerusalem from Judaism, and it failed. At a conference in Pittsburgh, Reform Judaism tried to modernize Judaism. They established 8 points. The Article 5 is critical. Article 5 of the Pittsburgh Platform removed the centrality of Israel and Jerusalem. It read, We recognize in the modern era of universal culture of heart and intellect the approaching of realization of Israel's great messianic hope for establishment of a kingdom of truth, justice, and peace among all men. We consider ourselves no longer a nation, but a religious community, and therefore expect neither a return to Palestine nor a sacrificial worship under the sons of Aaron, nor restoration of any of the laws concerning the Jewish state. For the next 100 years, elements within the Reform movement backpedaled the Pittsburgh platform, and eventually the Reform movement joined the Zionist movement. Jerusalem is not only central to Judaism, it is also a synonym for all of Israel. The best evidence of this is the Jerusalem Talmud. The Jerusalem Talmud was never composed or written in Jerusalem. It was written in the north. It received its name because, quite simply, Jerusalem is a metaphor for all of Israel. Jerusalem is the foundation stone for all of Judaism. It is where Judaism developed as a culture, as a people, as a society, as a nation, and as a religion. And our Jewish calendar recognizes its value. And that is why not only at the conclusion of every Passover Seder, but also at the conclusion of the high holiday Yom Kippur service, right after proclaiming the greatness of God, right before the blowing of the shofar, Jews across the world proclaim Shana Haba'ah B'Yerushalayim, next year in Jerusalem. Coming up next, Points of View. First up is a column from Ynet. It was written by Nachman Shai and was published on July 4th, 2023. The title of the column is, Would Biden Just Invite Netanyahu to the White House Already? Subtitle, Opinion. It's time to put an end to the pathetic games and hints. The U.S. President needs to talk with the Israeli Prime Minister face to face and make clear the implications of judicial overhaul and the Messianic coalition. Nachman Shai clearly lays out the issues. There is tension between the White House and Jerusalem. The best way to deal with this is to act like adults speaking about the issues, not playing games. Nachman Shai begins. We can all stop dropping hints, inferring presumptions, and raising speculations. Let's just say it as it is. Americans don't want Benjamin Netanyahu in Washington, D.C. Still, I have a message to communicate to them, and especially to President Joe Biden. Take him in. It's time to invite your friend over so that this pathetic saga can end. Now, Nachman Shai goes on to explain the White House point of view as to why they don't want Bibi. He writes, half a year has gone by since a new government was formed in Israel, and yes, it's a right-wing extremist messianic government that has made every mistake possible and continues to do so. From the very beginning, the Americans made it clear that they did not want to deal with certain parties, and especially not with specific individuals like Bezalel Smotrich and Itamar Ben-Gvir. Smotrich traveled all the way to Washington to find that the door was shut in his face before he even arrived. The Americans insisted that they have no intention of talking to this man, and that was before his call to wipe out the West Bank town of Huwara, which he called a slip of the tongue. Since then, several ministers have managed to provoke the Americans and consequently make it onto the persona non grata list. Now Nachman Shai writes, the lesson has been learned and it's time to move on. In his words, however, at the moment, the disadvantages of Biden's stubbornness outweigh the advantages. A visit to Washington will no longer be the victory lap Netanyahu dreamed of. Likewise, recent trips to Eastern European capitals ended in disappointment, and our democratic European friends have turned their noses up at Israel's new judicial ideas. This is surely not what the Prime Minister hoped for. A visit to Washington will shine a spotlight on Netanyahu as he receives both public and personal criticism. Outside of the White House, Israelis and local Jews will await him with protests. Inside the executive mansion, The Americans will remind him that the special relationship with the land of the free is based on the common values of the moral foundations and components of democracy. There's no going around it. Nachman Shai concludes by writing that matters have reached the point of being simply silly. It's time to stop the childish games, he writes. Meanwhile, Netanyahu forbids his ministers from traveling to the United States. Having no other choice, Defense Minister Yoav Gallant meets his American counterpart in Brussels, forced to make logistical adjustments while dire security interests like Iran are at stake. It's time to put an end to this. We would all be better off if Biden were to invite the Prime Minister to the White House and speak to him face to face. 2 nights at Blair House will not sweeten the pill awaiting Netanyahu's there. It is better for Netanyahu to rip off the Band-Aid and face anger at the White House, on Capitol Hill, and in the Jewish community. You wanted a visit, you got it. For the sake of all Israeli citizens, for the sake of the Jewish community in the United States, and for the sake of the relationship between the two countries, this bickering must be resolved. As always, Nachman Shai tells it like it is. Next up is a column by Daniela Shapiro that was published in the Wall Street Journal on Friday, Erev Shabbat, July 7th in print, and online the day before on July 6th, Thursday. The column is part of the Wall Street Journal's Houses of Worship section, which is part of their opinion pages. This wonderful column about Shabbat, about the Jewish day of rest, and about putting down your electric devices, turning off your phones, computers, and TVs, and reading real, solid, tangible material, and then talking about it. The column is called The Sabbath and the Printed Page, subtitled, On the Jewish Day of Rest, We Need Old-Fashioned Newspapers to Stay Informed. This is how Daniela Shapiro begins. The news cycle doesn't get a Sabbath, not the way my family does. At sundown every Friday, we power off our phones, refrain from driving, and spend the day in prayer and the company with loved ones. We shut out the busy world to focus on the Jewish day of rest because God rested too after his 6 days of creation. But the world doesn't reciprocate. When we block it out, politicians may work 9 to 5, but the same isn't true of war, weather, sports, and disease. Since we can't go online during the Sabbath, we cling to our print newspaper subscriptions like cherished family heirlooms. Shapiro is fighting an uphill battle, not because the strict observance of the Sabbath is so difficult, but because the print industry is hurting so badly, really hurting. Just think about the amount of mail we used to get every day in the mailboxes, and the amount that dribbles in nowadays. Print newspapers are hemorrhaging money, finding it almost impossible to make the bottom line. Shapiro continues, accessible online news has plunged the print newspaper industry into a free fall. America's population since 1990 has increased by almost 1/3, yet weekday circulation for the print versions of the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times has decreased by an estimated 60%. Local newspapers have fared far worse. While some polling shows Americans still favor print news over online formats, the price is too steep and the inconvenience too severe to curtail the downward trend. I hope print newspapers survive. When major events occur on a Friday night, my family goes on a news reading offensive on Saturday morning. Information might be limited as stories developed overnight, but that doesn't stop us from dissecting different slivers as the pieces of the unknown puzzle. The abortive Wagner Group mutiny, the 2017 National Basketball Association finals, Paris's 2015 terror attacks, and the 2017 Unite the Right March in Charlottesville. All got in, at least partially, just under the Friday night wire. The opinion writers and pundits didn't have time to editorialize in print before the evening deadlines, so we were forced to draw our own conclusions the next morning from the facts presented in the newspapers. The important point Shapiro is making is that the family meals The Shabbat meals are times when people sit together and unhurriedly talk. She continues, in my family, everyone comes from a traditional Shabbat lunch with prepared remarks. My father adopts a historical perspective. My mother is concerned with free speech and religious liberties. My brothers discuss the weekly Torah portion or the Mets. My sisters offer what they learned in business and medical school. I play devil's advocate. At a table that leans conservative, my brother-in-law is the lone liberal defending his convictions. Our little editorial board makes sense of breaking news and contextualizes the events of the week. The inability to rely on your phones challenges us to think more deeply. We can't Google for historical examples to support our arguments. Instead, we present and defend our positions based on knowledge from the reading we've already done. With all the technology available today, we sometimes forget how extraordinary our brains are. The Sabbath reminds us. Even if you don't celebrate the Jewish Sabbath, consider observing an online news Sabbath and renewing your print subscription to the newspaper. It may work wonders on how you make sense of the world. Thank you, Daniela Shapiro. An excellent comment. Families should all try having a Sabbath meal together, even multiple meals, and talking with one another. It's a nice experience. Coming up, commentary through cartoons, where pictures tell the story. I want to show you 6 cartoons, memes, and headlines today. First up is one of those signs that just make you laugh. The caption reads, "One day English will kill us." The sign reads, "Crocodiles do not swim here." That is truly funny. Punctuation. It's all about punctuation. Next up is another funny road sign, and the caption alludes to the Warner Brothers Looney Tunes character Elmer Fudd, the arch enemy of Bugs Bunny. The caption reads, "Elmer Fudd has a new job." Elmer Fudd had a speech impediment, and this sign reads, "Woodwork, 105 Avenue," where the spell check when you need a spell check on road signs. Next is a portrait of the great philosopher Descartes, depicted with crazy eyes. Descartes is famous, of course, for his conclusion, "Cogito ergo sum," I think, therefore I am. The caption reads, Descartes when he finds out that people who don't think also exist. I'm often stunned by what people ask me and tell me exactly that issue. This next meme is simply a perfect description of the difference between men and women, and I cannot even describe how silly and dangerous the situation is in the picture. The caption reads, "And yet again another example of why women live longer than men." Should be women, not women, but we'll accept that for what it is. Still very, very funny. This next item is a perfect example of what the author calls irony. A tree fell on an electric car. The caption reads, "This is what irony means. You buy an electric car to save the planet and a tree kills it. The truth is stranger than fiction." Next up is a headline announcing the closing of the National Geographic magazine. The headline reads, "National Geographic lays off its last remaining staff writers." This was truly an end of an era. It was one of the most important magazines and educational tools ever. Their kids magazine was even better than the regular magazine. As of 2024, National Geographic will no longer be sold at newsstands. In a moment, more of my own perspective and a few predictions. Israel's Security Cabinet decided overwhelmingly to prevent the fall of the Palestinian Authority. You heard that right. It voted 8-1 with one abstention to adopt the proposed resolution of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu that reads, "In the absence of a change in the national assessment, Israel will work to prevent the collapse of the Palestinian Authority while advancing the lawsuit to cease its activities against Israel in the international legal political arena, from the incitement in its media and educational systems, from payments to the families of terrorists and murderers, and from the illegal construction in Area C." The Security Cabinet also determined that, I'm quoting again, the Prime Minister and Defense Minister will propose to the Cabinet measures to stabilize the civil situation in the Palestinian arena. Say what you will, this is the Israeli way. Palestinians released footage allegedly showing rockets in the Jenin area. According to the Palestinians, these rockets were fired from Jenin toward the Israeli settlement of Kedumim, located in the West Bank. The IDF is examining and investigating the footage and the reports to determine whether they are true. This is typical, though. Rocket attacks continue even after a ceasefire or after an Israeli operation like the two-day operation to destroy the terror infrastructure in the refugee camp of Jenin. It is a terrorist way of saying that they were not defeated, and they're telling their people that Israel did not succeed. The U.S. Central Command has announced that it had conducted a strike that killed Osama al-Mahajir, an ISIS leader in eastern Syria. According to an official statement, the strike on Friday was conducted by the same MQ-9s that had earlier in the day been harassed by Russian aircraft in an encounter that had lasted almost 2 hours. To refresh your memory, the MQ-9s were the U.S. drones that the Russian fighters were toying with over Syrian airspace. Iran said that it had a court order to seize a tanker in the Gulf waters. They said that a day earlier the tanker collided with an Iranian vessel. The tanker they speak of is one of just 2 U.S. tankers in the Gulf right now. For their part, the U.S. Navy said it prevented Iran from commandeering the vessel. According to the Iranians, the Richmond Voyager's collision with an Iranian ship carrying 7 crew members had injured 5 people and caused flooding on board, and that the tanker had not stopped after the incident. The Iranian ship owners then requested the tanker be seized. This information, of course, comes from the Iranian media. Of late, there has been an uptick of Iranian efforts to disrupt commercial boats. It's not clear why the Iranians have been attempting to seize commercial ships in the Gulf. According to senior Pentagon officials, Under Secretary of Defense for Policy, Colin Kahl, who met with reporters, he said, "Why the Iranians are doing it at this moment is not at all clear to us." Kahl also said that it should be assumed that this would not be the last time that Iran tried to make such moves against commercial vessels. The IDF's Air Force has attacked Iranian targets in the city of Damascus, the capital city of Syria. Syrian anti-air systems weren't activated against the Air Force. The attack is the second one in Syria this week. The attack is Israel's response to a Syrian anti-tank round that was fired towards Israel. The Syrian round was intercepted by Israel on its way. According to IRNA, the official Iranian media source, Iran's Foreign Minister Hossein Abdullahian met Sudanese Foreign Minister for the first time since diplomatic relations between the two countries were severed 7 years ago. Iran's Foreign Minister Amir Abdullahian tweeted on the sidelines of the non-aligned movement meeting, "Our delegation met with Sudanese Foreign Minister and discussed how to imminently resume diplomatic ties between Khartoum and Tehran." Following the recent incident in which an Iraqi migrant burned a Quran outside a mosque in Stockholm, the Swedish government is considering a proposal to criminalize the desecration of sacred books. This act has sparked significant anger, not only among the Muslim community, but also among other religious communities worldwide. Swedish Justice Minister Gunnar Stomer stated that the burning of the Quran has undermined the internal security of Sweden. Sweden has requested entry into NATO and was fearful that after the Quran burning would jeopardize their chances because Turkey's significant role in approving their request. But the incident aside, Turkish President Erdogan has agreed to advance the Swedish bid to join NATO. Gilad Erdan, Israel's United Nations ambassador, called on the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres to retract his condemnation of Israel for what Guterres termed Israel's excessive use of force in its largest military operation in 2 decades, targeting a refugee camp in the West Bank. UN Deputy Spokesperson Farhan Haq responded to Erdogan's request, saying that the Secretary General stands by those views. In an interview with CNN's Fareed Zakaria, President Joe Biden said that Israel and Saudi Arabia are far from normalization. In that same interview, Biden was also extremely critical of Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu. In answer to a question about President Biden's extending an invitation to Bibi, Biden responded that Israeli President Herzog is coming to the White House. We've been thinking out loud about a lot today. Now that you know what I've been thinking, let me know what you're thinking. Email me at micah@jbstv.org. Tweet me at Micah Halpern. Tell me what you think. Before we end, let me leave you with one piquante piece of information. We spoke about the burning of the Quran in Sweden and about the Swedish proposed law to ban burning holy books. Did you know that Jewish books were burned quite often during times of Jewish persecution, especially during the Middle Ages? You may be surprised to learn that Jews, yes, Jews, actually burnt books written by Maimonides, the Rambam. Why? Because the established community at the time did not like what Maimonides had to say in his intro to his great work, the Mishnah Torah. The introduction is still with us today. It's still in every Mishnah Torah in Hebrew. What Maimonides was brilliant. It was brilliant, but he was also self-important. Maimonides wrote that this book, his book, the Mishnah Torah, is the only book anyone will ever need after the Bible. That's why we call it Mishnah Torah, the second Torah. Fast forward many years later to contemporary times, and you will be just as surprised to learn that there were people in Israel who burned the works of Rabbi Adin Steinsaltz of all people. While I'm certainly not in favor of burning books, it is a form of expression, and I'm hesitant to limit freedom of speech. It is like the important Supreme Court flag burning case in June. The opinion was issued in June of 1989. In this landmark 5-4 case, Texas versus Johnson, that burning a U.S. flag is protected by free speech, by the First Amendment. The facts were pretty simple. In 1984, at the Republican National Convention that was held in Dallas, the Revolutionary Communist Youth Brigade protested the Republicans, especially then President Ronald Reagan. They conducted a parade that ended on the steps of the Dallas City Hall. And there, Gregory Lee Johnson poured kerosene on the flag and lit it. No one was hurt, although some people were deeply insulted. One person actually gathered the burned remains of the flag and buried them in his yard. It's hard for me to say these things. The Constitution and the law are very clear. Speech that hurts and speech that is wrong and misinformed is also protected speech under the Constitution. Thank you for thinking out loud with me, Micah Halpern. Let's think out loud again next week on JBS.